My name is Raphael Rowe. I'm now a journalist, but I was once the victim of a miscarriage of justice which changed my life forever. In 1990, I was convicted of a murder that I did not commit. I spent over a decade in maximum security prisons. It took me 12 years to eventually clear my name. Now, I'm going on a journey to explore other high-profile miscarriages of justice to find out how the fight for many of those acquitted continues to this day.
The judges totally ignored me today. I think that shows the arrogance of the system.
I thought to myself, this is justice, it'll come out. They let me go eventually, but it took 20 years.
After all these years, the case is still unsolved.
And I'll examine the impact this injustice has had on the families of the murder victims.
He went through it all, so he knows exactly what they've done to you.
I can see, my heart goes out for what you went through.
And understand what we can learn to stop miscarriages of justice from happening in the future.
I looked at the jury and I thought, you got it so wrong. What have you done?
On the evening of October the 12th, 1987, in the Cardiff district of Canton, a local man was brutally beaten and robbed outside his home. The victim was 52-year-old Philip Saunders, a successful businessman who owned newsagents in the area. The attack was so severe, he died of his injuries 5 days later. It then became a murder inquiry.
We are treating it very seriously, and we are appealing to the members of the public, particularly those in this area who may have seen anything suspicious, let us know.
In a massive police operation, dozens were interviewed in the hunt for the 6-foot man.
At the time, the police questioned over 40 suspects before charging 3 young men with murder. 20-year-old Michael O'Brien, his 19-year-old brother-in-law Ellis Sherwood, and 18-year-old Darren Hall. The men spent 11 years behind bars before their convictions were finally quashed in a case so infamous they became known as the Cardiff Newsagent 3. But that was only the start of their struggle. I'm on my way to meet Michael O'Brien, one of the Cardiff Newsagent 3 defendants whose convictions were quashed for the murder of Philip Saunders. The ironic thing is Michael and his co-defendants were arrested in the same year that I was arrested. They were sent to life imprisonment in the same way that I was. I'm hoping that Michael will be able to share with me how much of this case has consumed his life, because I know all too well the psychological hangover, the legacy of spending years in prison for a crime you didn't commit has on you. Hello, Michael.
Hi.
How you doing?
I'm
very well.
Yeah.
Really nice to meet you.
And you at last.
At last, yeah.
Oh, I've met so many miscarriages of justice victims and I haven't met you.
No, well now you have. On the night of the attack on Philip Saunders, Michael O'Brien and Ellis Sherwood were with Darren Hall attempting to steal cars in the area. Darren Hall later incriminated all 3 men in the murder of the respected businessman. They were arrested, questioned, released and re-arrested before being charged with murder. Why did you become the focus of the police investigation?
Well, from what I understand, there was a dragnet system and my co-accused Darren Hall did have a criminal record and they brought him in and he was the one who implicated us.
What was he saying about you and Ellis?
He was saying that he was the lookout while me and Ellis went in there and killed him. And then he turned it around and said, no, he killed him and he hit him with a house brick.
In all this time, were there no solicitors involved protecting you and the others?
Just before we got charged, they allowed us to see a solicitor because while we were in the police cells, a police officer alleges me and Ellis Sherwood confessed to the crime talking between the cells.
So you and your co-defendant Ellis are in adjacent cells?
Yes.
A police officer is standing there with you?
Outside, well, hiding behind the cells with a notepad, he reckons, an expenses form, and he just so happened to hear us confessing.
So you've been telling the police consistently that you had nothing to do with it, miraculously, a police officer says that you're having a confessional conversation between you and your co-defendant.
Yes, he said he could hear us talking and shouting through the doors, yes.
And was that true?
No, it wasn't true.
It's shocking to hear Michael's belief that the police had generated false evidence against the men in the murder of Philip Saunders. But I want to explore how South Wales Police set about investigating the crime. I've come to where in 1987 the violent assault took place.
I've just arrived at Ainsley Court where I'm going to meet Tom Bedford, the crime reporter for the South Wales Echo back in 1987. He covered the case and I want to find out a little bit more from him about what happened to Philip Saunders and that fateful night. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming down to meet me.
My pleasure.
What did you find out at the time about what had happened?
It emerged quite quickly that the victim had head injuries, I think was in a coma in hospital. We didn't get a lot of detail about Mr. Saunders himself. We knew he was a city centre businessman.
I understand that the police carried out a reconstruction. They did things. Were you at that reconstruction? What can you tell me about that?
I was. We started off in the city centre at Philip Saunders' newspaper kiosk. So he'd shut up his kiosk at 10 o'clock, go and have a couple of pints in the Albert Public House in the city centre, return to his car, drive here to Ainsley Court with his takings and come home for the night.
They did have one vital lead. From her window, a neighbour had seen a man attacking Mr. Saunders.
The police found Philip Saunders had been grievously wounded to the head with repeated blows from a garden spade. His shop takings of £500 had been stolen and he'd been left for dead.
So this is the garden where Mr. Saunders was seriously assaulted and robbed?
He was on a life support machine in University Hospital in Wales for 5 days. Whether he ever regained consciousness, I don't know, but I would guess he probably didn't. And he would have died, I'm sure, with his relatives at his bedside when they took the terrible decision to turn off that life support machine.
I'm trying to think of Philip Saunders right now. You know, he was attacked viciously here in this garden, and standing in that garden with Tom made me think of that horrific night. And the sad thing is, Philip Saunders has still not got justice.
To better understand the critical evidence against Michael O'Brien and Ellis Sherwood, I've come to Glamorgan's archives in Cardiff, which holds many of the trial documents, including the account of the alleged overheard police cell confession between the two men.
This is one of the original statements. One of the investigating police officers claimed that this is the conversation he heard between O'Brien and Sherwood. I'm scared, I'll have to tell them what happened. That's Michael O'Brien saying to Sherwood, Sherwood, just keep your mouth shut. O'Brien, why don't you tell them what happened? Sherwood, I can't, can I? If Hall hadn't opened his mouth, we wouldn't be here. Sherwood, I think there's someone listening. I'll catch up with you later, okay? O'Brien, yeah, okay. End. They're in a police cell. How would they know if someone's listening? And if they thought someone was listening, why were they confessing? It seems like something that was done to end the conversation. Not because the guys were ending the conversation, but the copper needed a way out. That's my reading of it. And believe me, I've read a lot of statements in my time, in my own case, I'm talking thousands, where people were saying, I gave Rafael a balaclava to commit the robbery, and I knew that didn't happen. How many times can you read a line where somebody's saying something that you know is not true? So I hear what these guys are going through when they read this.
As well as the alleged overheard cell confession, the police case relied heavily on the admission of the third defendant, Darren Hall, that he, Michael O'Brien and Ellis Sherwood were responsible for the murder. To find out a bit more about Darren Hall, I'm on my way to meet someone who knew him well.
I've just driven out of Cardiff city centre to meet Stuart Hutton, who was the solicitor for Darren Hall at the time of the crucial appeal, where the confession that he made was tested. And so I want to try and find out why that confession became so unreliable. Hello, Stuart.
Hello.
Raphael Rowe.
Nice to see you.
Thank you very much
Please,
for
come
inviting
in.
me to your home. Thank you.
Come in.
Where
Just
are
to
we
the
going?
right. I'll lead the way.
What do you think generally about this case?
What is quite remarkable in the case is that there is no forensic evidence. A spade was used to kill Mr. Saunders. There had been splashes of blood. Nothing was on any of their clothing to corroborate or support at all.
Darren Hall, how would you describe him?
A strange person, and I mean that kindly of him, intellectually challenged, and the system couldn't deal with him.
What did you learn about the confession when you agreed to take on his case?
He wasn't granted legal representation appropriately.
At the point of arrest?
At the point of arrest, and he was got onto by the police for quite a significant amount of time, day and night, wearing him down to get him eventually to confess. And that's what he did.
And would you describe it as a false confession?
Yes, because the equation wasn't there to know whether or not that confession was safe or satisfactory.
And that's what baffles me. How did it get past the police and the Crown Prosecution Service and the first trial when you're dealing with such a character?
The courts are not always willing to accept expert evidence. The jury are entitled to disregard it. So it's not cast in stone. The big danger with the police sidestepping an investigation, drawing inappropriate conclusions, not testing their case properly and vigorously, has allowed time to pass so the real perpetrator can slip away into the sunset.
11 years in prison is a sad state of affairs, as I've heard that confession was instrumental in their wrongful conviction, when it didn't have to be that way. It's quite clear from everything I've learned that Darren Hall was a vulnerable individual to secure a conviction against anyone for a crime where they should have been looking for the right people. It's a sad and sorry state of affairs, it really is.
South Wales, the 1980s. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's policies of privatisation and mining closures decimated once thriving communities.
They will take your pension contributions and spend them on their socialist schemes. There is no surrender.
Unemployment and crime were on the rise, and police were increasingly facing accusations of heavy-handedness and misconduct. One case in particular was to become one of the country's most infamous miscarriages of justice. 3 young Cardiff men, Michael O'Brien, Ellis Sherwood and Darren Hall, had been stealing cars but were wrongly imprisoned for over a decade for the murder of Philip Saunders. They were convicted mostly from alleged confessions in police custody made without a solicitor. At the time, a new law known as the Police and Criminal Evidence Act had been introduced. It required formal tape recordings of all custody interviews, but its rules were not always being followed at Canton Police Station.
Jerry, it's nice to meet you. Tell me where you are in the world.
I want an insight into the practices of South Wales Police during that era, so I'm talking to retired Detective Jerry Toms, who's currently in Qatar.
But you were working at South Wales Police, you were a CID officer. What was the behaviour of the force at your time?
I joined South Wales Police back in 1971. That's a long time ago now. I must say, honestly, that in some parts there was a very cavalier attitude towards the rules of interview and the rules of justice. And if we just sort of look at the 1970s, people were becoming concerned that the police had been really sort of overstepping the mark in terms of the way in which they treated suspects and recorded evidence. And hence that's the reason why the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, that came into being to try and address that balance between the need for the police to investigate and to protect the interests of the person arrested.
It's interesting because in the modern day there is all sorts of technology that can record whether it's a verbatim record. But back in the day when you were doing it, was that open to abuse from police officers?
There was always the potential for that. Unfortunately, the rules were pretty lax. And therefore, if you had an officer who wanted to take advantage of that, that was easily done. The most classic way was what we would call a verbal. So an officer would interview somebody, they would write in something into the notes which hadn't been said.
In the case of the Cardiff newsagent 3, at the time, this particular officer said that he, took a record of a conversation between two prisoners in the cell. Do you know anything about that, and was that common practice?
Yeah, well, can I say, in terms of that particular case and that particular officer, I'm not able to comment because I wasn't directly involved in that case. However, it's interesting to note in the sort of late 70s, early 80s, there are several cases where the same officers are involved, and in those cases, their evidence has been discredited on more than one occasion.
What do you think about the fact that some officers behaved in such a way that people could spend years in prison for serious crimes that they didn't commit?
It's an acute embarrassment. In my experience, the vast majority of police officers in those days were themselves law-abiding. There would be officers' names bandied around, but could you stand up and announce that and sort of whistle-blow on that officer? You couldn't, because you didn't have the evidence yourself. Rumour is one thing, speculation in another, evidence is something vastly different.
The interesting thing is, although Jerry talked about how when these guys were in custody there were no real protections, like the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, where interviews in police stations were recorded. When the Metropolitan Police took me in and questioned me, those protections were in place, but they didn't make very much difference. I mean, yeah, it provided me an opportunity to say I didn't do it, and there was a record of me continuously saying that. Nothing in my own interviews were used against me because there was nothing to be used against me. But just imagine for a moment with these guys where those records were not kept, and Michael's kept telling me that he consistently told the police he didn't do it.
In addition to the alleged cell confession between Michael O'Brien and Ellis Sherwood, a crucial piece of evidence was the damning confession of the third defendant, Darren Hall, who implicated all three men in the murder. I want to understand how today Darren Hall's false confession rests with Michael and Ellis.
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you.
Good to see you, man.
Yeah.
Ellis here? Ellis.
Hi.
How you doing?
Still there.
Soon after leaving prison, Ellis suffered a stroke that affects his mobility and speech.
It's so strange seeing you two, after all this time in the same room together, because I have visions of a 20-year-old Michael and a 19-year-old Ellis going through this ordeal for the very first time. But you're no longer those young men, are you?
I got a lot of respect for Ellis, for what he's been through, and he's been through worse than me, and he's still there, still fighting.
What I'm most interested in today is Darren's confession implicating you in the murder of Philip Saunders and the robbery. Ellis, when did you first hear that your co-defendant, Darren Hall, had made a confession?
Police got the door, break it, and I said, right, you done it, and whatever. I said, no, I didn't. But the police, whatever, so I nicked for nothing, and then it was like, you're lying. The police said, no, we haven't. We done nothing. And then I was in prison then.
What about you, Michael?
During the interviews, they were saying to me, your co-accused has confessed. And it was really difficult because I'm 20 years of age trying to explain a psychologist's job. And unless you've come across somebody like him, it's very difficult to explain the person that he was and the personality that he had.
What happened to him in the end?
Well, as far as I'm aware, he got married, and that was the last I heard.
And that's it.
I don't blame Darren Hall anymore. I know who's responsible, and that relies with the police. I won't forget what he's done, don't get me wrong, that's a different matter, but I have to forgive him if I'm going to move on.
And do you, Ellis, share Michael's view about Darren? Do you forgive him for what he did?
I'll come here, I don't know, I'll probably batter him, sorry.
You still have anger in your heart for what he did?
Yeah, that's it, because in prison for nothing, what you do.
Very different views. Thank you both very much for talking with me again today.
You're welcome.
The contrast between Michael to Ellis is quite sad, really. Two men, young men, go to prison for crimes they didn't commit. and they've come out and their lives are completely different now, both affected by that experience. Such a big contrast.
I've tried to find Darren Hall to get his side of things, but despite repeated efforts, couldn't make contact. With so much focus on the 3 accused men at the time, not much was reported on the murder victim, Philip Saunders.
One of the things I'm most interested in, who Philip Saunders was. So what can you tell me about this guy?
So Saunders was quite a quiet man. He was a bachelor in terms of no wife, no children, but quite a successful businessman.
And there was a lot of interest from the media about this.
Nationally, certainly, yes. In those days, newspapers, I think, had a little bit of loyalty towards people who sold the newspapers, like Philip Saunders did. And the Daily Star put this £1,000 reward out for information.
And that was often the case, wasn't it? Even in my own case, there was a £25,000 reward, and that was in 1988, a huge amount of money, so £1,000. But that was quite a powerful incentive for people to come forward.
Yes, yeah. Well, Philip Saunders' own family put £1,000 into the reward fund as well to try and trap the thug, as they said at the time.
I want to understand more about Philip from those who knew him best. Despite never publicly speaking about the murder before, Philip Saunders' only sister Phoebe and her son David, Philip's nephew, have agreed to meet me.
Hi Phoebe. Raphael, nice to meet you. How are you guys?
Fine,
Not too
thank
bad.
you.
I'm so interested in finding out more about your brother. Can you help me paint a picture?
Well, Philip was my brother, but he wasn't Philip, he was Icky from birth.
Icky?
Icky, I-C-K-Y. His nickname, my grandfather said it at birth as he got older. Icky had stalls in the market, outdoor market.
That was his work, was it?
Yes.
He's a bit of a, bit of a dull boy, I suppose. Really,
Yeah.
if you could make a buck out of it, he'd try and be part of it. And
He must have had the gift for the gab then,
Oh,
because
yes.
to do that kind of stuff, and
Yes.
entrepreneurial skills.
If somebody wanted something, if they would have been short of money, he would say, there we are.
What about his relationships? Because he never married and had kids, did
No. He did say he was going to get engaged to this girl, but nothing came of it. He did keep in touch, but he was a loner. He went to live in Anstey Court, where he was murdered.
he? When did you first hear that your brother had been attacked?
Can you come over the radio?
You heard about your brother?
On the radio.
Did they mention his name at the time, or was
Yep.
it?
Yeah.
That's not the right way, is it, to hear?
But I did go in and see him and make sure that, I said, yeah, that's him, whatever. And I did hold his hands.
So in all the time that he was in hospital, the police didn't come and talk to you about what had happened to your brother?
No, the police never contacted me. Only when they started to harass the children.
They asked where I was at the time, which I said, I was playing ice hockey. They also picked up my wife, Daniel, he was a toddler, whilst they were interviewing me in Canton Police Station, and the police had the cheek to turn around and say to me, if you just tell us what happened, and admit that it's done, and then she could go on her way.
So in the initial investigation, you were a suspect yourself?
Oh, yes.
And this is before they eventually arrested the 3 guys that ended up in prison?
Yeah.
The notion that Philip Saunders' own nephew could be held under suspicion of murdering his uncle is alarming. Now more than ever, I want to delve further into the role the police played into the miscarriage of justice of the Cardiff newsagent 3. In June 1988, 8 months after the brutal murder of Cardiff shopkeeper Philip Saunders, the trial of Michael O'Brien, Ellis Sherwood and Darren Hall began. There was no forensic evidence placing the Cardiff newsagent free at the crime scene. The case against them was built largely on witness testimony and alleged confessions obtained in police custody.
Michael's asked me to meet him here at Cardiff Crown Court to talk a little bit about what it was like during his trial. Morning, Michael.
Morning.
You're right.
Yeah, how are you doing?
I'm good. So this is
I mean,
Cardiff Crown Court?
Yeah, this is where it all happened, believe it or not. Bit of a weird feeling being on the other side,
It
I
is,
suppose.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Because when you come to a court, you don't walk up the steps and go through the front door, do you? I suspect that you came in a police van through the back
there's
gate.
one at the back there, I can see one.
People often believe that when you end up in a court, it's your moment, it's your chance to show that you didn't do what you're accused of being done. My view is different. When you're in the dock, you're guilty in the eyes of everybody because you wouldn't be there otherwise. What was it like for you?
Well, I think that pretty much sums up how I felt as well, you know. I just knew that it wasn't looking good. Because of the evidence and the way they portrayed us, yes, we were out on the night in question. Yes, I allowed myself to be carried in a stolen car, but I certainly didn't deserve, and neither did the other two, deserve what they did to us.
Did you get a fair trial?
No, we didn't get a fair trial.
It was a 10-2 majority, wasn't it? And I found it incredible when I was reading one of the newspaper reports the other day that said, despite the fact that Darren Hall had confessed, 2 members of that jury, they still didn't believe him.
Well, you'd have thought it would have been an unanimous decision. Those 2 jury members got it spot on.
I've been there, you've been there. It's that kind of desperation when you're standing in the dock. What was it like for you?
It's a horrible, horrible feeling you get in your guts when you see these people going into the box time after time, one after the other, knowing that they're lying about you. The disturbing thing for me was the judge's comments when we were found guilty. It's basically telling us you've had every opportunity through your lawyers and your barristers to put your case to the jury. In my view, you've been rightly convicted, rightly so, and there's only one sentence I can give you for such a crime, which is one of life, and 8 years for the robbery. I was just... my head was spinning.
Who was there supporting you?
My mum, my father, my sister was there supporting me. I mean, when we got found guilty, I remember I shouted out, as long as you know I didn't do it, Dad, that's all what matters. And I had tears streaming down my face. And I looked at the jury and I thought, you got it so wrong. What have you done?
After a 5-week trial, the 3 defendants were sentenced to life in prison for murder. They were all under 21 years of age.
I know he hadn't done it, but if we thought for 1 second,
that he'd done
1
it.
second, that Michael had an inclination about doing that, we would disown him.
In 1990, the Cardiff newsagent 3 appealed against their convictions, but were denied. From prison, Michael O'Brien drove a robust campaign that reached Dennis Eady from Cardiff University Law School, who would become a key ally.
Dr. Eady?
Hi.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for agreeing to meet me. I know that you are the director of the law school here and you're involved in the Innocence Project. What does that actually mean?
Well, what the Innocence Project does is to engage law students in trying to review and reinvestigate potential miscarriages of justice and whether we can find any viable grounds for appeal. And one of the first cases that came to us was, in fact, Michael O'Brien and the Newsagent 3 case.
And what year was this?
This was 1992.
So they would have been in prison 4 or 5 years by now?
Yeah.
How did the case come through your door?
Yeah, we used to have meetings with the group, and Michael's mother and sister came one evening to the meeting. But what we did do was to try and publicise the case.
Lots of relatives protest the innocence of their loved ones in prison. To anyone that will listen to them, they're that desperate. So what was it about the case involving Michael Ellis and Darren that really caught your attention?
What they were describing kind of mirrored the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6, the Bridgewater 4, those type of cases. This sort of pattern of a vulnerable person, one of the group, who's put under tremendous pressure in police custody and ends up making a confession.
The alleged false confession of Darren Hall.
Yeah. So the CCRC then commissioned the Thames Valley Police Report.
And the CCRC is?
The Criminal Cases Review Commission. Their role is to investigate potential miscarriage of justice. The 3 were denied access to solicitors, which is fundamental. Their interviews were not recorded. Darren's interviews often happen when there's an unrecorded gap. The Thames Valley Police concluded was that, he was probably being interviewed off the record before the formal interview. And that's the time he makes these admissions which incriminate himself and others. So the whole thing was a complete reversal of pace almost, what was going on. There were so many infringements going on. And that's before you get to the claims that Darren, Ellis and Michael were making, that they were bullied.
What else did you find out about their case?
What we learnt was this supposed confession in the cells between Michael and Ellis. The investigating officer was supposedly outside the cells taking down this conversation. The Thames Valley Police report later found out he didn't actually register as an exhibit for the trial. He actually produced it in the middle of the trial. It's extraordinary that that piece of evidence could persist.
By 1998, a decade after they'd been imprisoned, the campaign to free them became supercharged. Witnesses who testified at trial retracted their statements, claiming duress from the police. Crucially, this included Darren Hall, who said he'd lied in implicating himself and his co-defendants in Philip Saunders' murder. In December 1998, all three men were at last granted leave to appeal and released on bail, but their fight was far from over.
Didn't expect it. Had already Christmas dinner sorted out with the lads on the wing, is it up? Yeah, roast beef and everything.
The emotions that must have been running through these guys at the point that they're released from prison, you know, this is not preparation for release. As elating as it would be for them, there's an enormous come down because there is still the fear that the judges won't agree with the evidence and decide that actually you need to go back to prison to serve out the rest of your life sentence. Michael, Ellis and Darren Hall, for that matter, were out on bail, enjoying rebuilding their lives, but it could have been taken away at any moment.
In January 2000, Michael O'Brien, Ellis Sherwood and Darren Hall appealed against their convictions for the 1987 murder of Cardiff newsagent Philip Saunders. The judges concluded there had been breaches of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act by South Wales Police and that Darren Hall's confession was unreliable. The judges ruled the convictions were unsafe and they were quashed. After serving 11 years in prison, the Cardiff newsagent 3 were finally free. I'm catching up with Michael again. I want to understand the psychological impact his years of wrongful imprisonment has had.
How much has your whole experience consumed your life, Michael? Do you still hang on to paperwork and documents and stuff about your case?
Yeah, I got some scrapbooks in the cupboard here, which I can share with you.
Okay. Oh, these are cuttings from back in the day. That's
back
when you
in the
were
day, yeah.
a man wrongly accused of newsagent murder welcomes new police inquiry. It's almost a replica because I have these. I have these scrapbooks. I write diaries. I have, you know, the legacy of my past. I mean, I suppose at one point you kind of gather it because it kind of builds your momentum, doesn't it? Reading articles about yourself. Okay, I see that you've also got some articles dating back to 1987. That would be even before you were arrested.
Yes.
Murder probe, hunt for burglar, newsagents still fighting for life. And these are photocopies that you were able to obtain when you were in prison or after?
Yeah, I got them sent in to me, yeah, and I've kept them. And I was sent to some really heavy-duty, top-security prisons, as you know, you've been there yourself. The first year, I was on all sorts of drugs. I knew I had problems.
Right.
But then I managed to pick myself up. I met some of the Birmingham Six in prison. I met some of the Carl Bridgewater in prison, you know, other innocent people as well.
Me too, me too.
And they said to me, what are you doing about your wrongful conviction? If you want to do something, you've got to write letters. They were harsh with me, but they were spot on. I managed to get off all the drugs. Started going down the gym 2-3 times a week. And then the anger came. The anger, how dare you do this to me?
I could be on that sofa, you could be interviewing me because you're almost saying everything that I've said over the years to this anger. Phone call clue for murder hunt police, 3 charged. And why do you keep these, Michael?
For my son, so he can have a look at, so he can see what I went through, and also for him to understand what went wrong.
Have you shown him these articles yet?
I haven't yet. I think he's too young, you know, to be honest with you. He's only 9. He's very bright kid mind, but I just don't think it's appropriate.
It's so interesting you say that because when my son turned 12, I think it was, and I was in the position now where I had to tell him about my case. I didn't know how to do it. It was probably the most difficult thing I've ever had to do. And I actually got out my scrapbooks and I actually showed him the articles, and he's kind of, "You've been to prison, Dad? You were in prison for murder you didn't commit," kind of thing, and he wasn't comprehending it. And I opened the articles and showed him the headlines that said wrongly convicted, conviction quashed, because then by reading the headlines he could comprehend that it was real and that I didn't do it, because, you know, after about 5 minutes he lost interest. But a few weeks later, something's gone and I sort of say, "Did you do that?" And he said, "No, and you know what it's like to be accused of something you didn't do." So when I'm telling my kid that, brilliant. So he got it. But they do get it, even when they're young, and you try and impress in their thoughts that that's your experience, that's what you went through. So he will. It was so uncanny listening to Michael describe his own experience, because it made me think very much about my own. And you can just hear the emotion in his voice, you can see the pain in his eyes. He really went through the grind. First and foremost, the victim was the man that was murdered, Philip Saunders, and the police didn't do him justice. And when you listen to Michael and the ordeal he's been through, he didn't get justice either.
I was absolutely outraged when I asked the judges for an apology for the way we were treated. The judges totally ignored me today. I think that shows the arrogance of the system. They don't give a damn about victims of miscarriages of justice.
Since his release, Michael has launched several legal challenges and complaints against South Wales Police. There have been no findings of perjury or misconduct following inquiries into the case. However, Michael and Ellis did receive one of the largest out-of-court settlements ever given by an English or Welsh police force. With additional compensation from the Home Office, Michael's overall payment was over £900,000 and Ellis £1.4 million. But can any amount of money make up for the years they have lost?
I can't imagine how emotional you must be feeling right now, Michael.
Michael still seeks closure from the family of the man he was wrongly convicted of murdering. Today, he's meeting Philip Saunders' sister Phoebe and nephew David for the very first time.
Deep breath, you okay?
Yeah, I'm okay. Oh. Bit nervous. Oh.
David, this is Michael, Phoebe.
I have so longed for this day. I don't think you realise how long. I am so grateful for you to be here today, you know. I mean...
I'm grateful for you coming.
I wanted to let you know for so long that we never done this crime, you know, and I've shed so many tears over this case. Philip as well. You're the primary victims, you know, because Philip was your relative. Somebody done some horrible things to him. Because of what they did to him, all the things happened to me. I lost my daughter when I was inside.
What, died?
Yes, my marriage split up. I didn't have a lot, but I lost everything. But this is just an amazing day.
It is nice to have met you.
Icky's death, obviously we can't...
Bring him back.
Bring him back. But also, from your point of view, I can semi-understand.
How long he lost of his
yeah.
life. This boy was arrested twice. He went through it all, so he knows exactly what they've done to you.
I'm so shocked at that.
Oh, yes, they had him.
So shocked at it. Like,
you of all people.
The second time when I was arrested and I was on my way up to Merthyr police station, as we come down to there, in my mind, I'm thinking to myself, could I get out of this car now and jump into the TAF, because it's right by the TAF, to get away from the police? Because in my mind, I'm thinking to myself, you and the other two fellas, I'm thinking to myself, am I going to be stitched up here now? And am I going to be doing the same as you? And I had that big, big fear in my mind.
It's the horriblest feeling, isn't it? You know, when you know you haven't done anything.
Yeah, it's
I mean, terrified.
And so therefore, as I say, this is why I could say Oh, my heart goes out for what you went through.
But do you see how I feel for you as well, knowing you haven't had justice? The things which went on in that Canton police station...
You would never believe.
Well, I got to be honest with you. We were out on a night in question, trying to joyride. You know, I did do wrong. Murder, that would be the last thing on my mind.
You can't put a plaster and repair the damage that it have done to you or your family or anything. You can't bandage it up.
No,
but that 13 years is gone.
But it's the same for you as well, though, isn't it? It's the same on your, you know, from your side, you know.
That's why we can feel for you, because we know what we've gone through.
I just want to, you know, I didn't want to interrupt or chirp in at any point. It was very emotional. I felt really emotional.
Well, I'm glad that we agreed to see you. I've often thought about you, and I know David has.
Can I just ask how you feel now that you have met each other?
Oh, I feel very, well, relieved and glad, because I've been able to
say... From our point of view, I think it's moving on.
This is part closure for me. The next closure is we got to try and catch a real killer.
All I hope is I'm still alive when they find out who really did it. Because I'm 92 and a half now, so...
Wow, well, that's amazing. You look, well, if I look like that at 92, I'd be well happy, I tell you. I'm so grateful to you both, honestly. You've made my day today.
That's all right.
You made my day.
I'll be back in a minute.
I love him. Poor thing. I don't think he done it.
You all right, Michael?
That's amazing, that was.
I just loved how you reacted, you know, that, you know, they're the primary victims here and that's at the forefront of your mind. How are you feeling right now?
I'm feeling good because I've actually know that they don't believe that we done it. That means so much to me because I've always had that at the back of my mind for many years. Do they really think we done it?
Good luck, Mike, and thank you so much for spending all this time with me.
No, thank
you.
you.
Forward and live your life with your son. Don't let it consume your life.
I will do, and I will do something positive, because that's what's going to come out of all this, is positivity.
I've heard a lot of things in this case that reminds me of my own experiences of being a victim of a miscarriage of justice. Michael O'Brien and his co-defendants were victims. Philip Saunders, Phoebe, David and the rest of their relatives were victims. And this case remains open. But what happened there offered both sides in this tragic, tragic case some form of closure. It makes me realise that these cases are far more complicated than you could ever imagine.